After the US launched its attack on Iran right at the end of February this year, the general discussion was about a huge energy crisis coming our way. Fatih Birol, head of the IEA in Paris, told us that the scale of the crisis we are now facing is set to make past oil shocks seem like mere warm-up acts. It was the biggest energy crisis in history. Really? The biggest crisis in energy in history? Bigger than the OPEC shocks of the 1970s? Let's just stand back a moment and reflect on what is only 12 weeks of this conflict, now in ceasefire mode, has produced. First and foremost, if it was the biggest ever energy crisis in history, surely we'd be facing $200 oil today, or at least the equivalent of where it was in 79, which was about $170 in current prices, $39 at the time. We're not. The price has gone above $100 a barrel, but it's fallen back to just below now. It may go up a bit, may come down a bit. But this is not a high price, and is not a price that reflects the greatest crisis in history. And if we look behind the scenes and ask ourselves, well, who's in trouble? Who is badly affected by this particular instance in the Gulf? Let's start with the big players and the big consumers and producers, in some cases, of oil. Let's start with the US, China, and Russia, the big three. Well, for Russia, it's almost unambiguously good news. This crisis has come to Russia's rescue, or at least it's paused its decline in the context of its ever-running war against the Ukrainian people. It gets a higher price, and it gets relief from sanctions. It's shipping oil round to China, to India, and indeed almost everywhere in the context in which it suddenly finds itself flavour of the month, at least flavour of the month when it comes to oil cargoes. So, not bad for Russia. What about the US? Well, the US is by far the world's largest oil producer. And having gone from a declining oil and gas position, it found itself by the end of the last decade with 12, 13 million barrels a day oil production. Compare, say, 9 million barrels a day with Saudi Arabia and 10 with Russia, so by far the biggest. And it found itself going from a position whereby Qatar was developed to provide LNG gas to the United States to a world where by 2016 it started exporting LNG, reversing all those import terminals that had been built for that Qatari gas. And now it's the largest LNG exporter in the world. It can command top prices and take up the, quote, opportunity that the loss of Qatari gas has brought to the world markets. Not bad, really, from an economic perspective. The revenues are up considerably, albeit in a capitalist and private free enterprise system. These flow through companies and not automatically to consumers. American consumers are paying more. Inflation's edged up a bit in the United States, but this may prove to be temporary rather than permanent. So, Russia and the US, it's pretty good, really. You've got the stuff, and you find that your major competitors are out of the market. What about China? Now, China is very exposed to the Straits of Hormuz and the Gulf for its oil and indeed its gas supplies. It takes 38%, or rather it took 38% of everything going through the Straits of Hormuz, and was rivaled by India coming through with about 18%. That's not good news. That's not a diversified supply. And although China has access to Russia and elsewhere for oil and indeed LNG cargoes, you'd think that China was reeling from the consequences of this biggest energy crisis in history we've been told we're in. Well, not quite, because China's energy policy is very much based upon national self-sufficiency in as far as it can get and secure supply chains where possible. What China has is the ability to flex its enormous coal position in energy. It burns already more than half the world's total coal, and for all the talk about renewables and other stuff in China, it's the flex of coal which gives it a great deal of energy security. And it's building another 400 gigawatts of coal to add to the system. The wind and the solar are a good contribution to its energy mix, and the sun doesn't stop shining because of the greatest energy crisis in history, nor does the wind stop blowing. And it's building lots of nuclear power stations too, though it's a bit behind in terms of the timing of that with this particular crisis. And then finally, pursuing its national self-interest, it has built an enormous stockpile of oil in particular, which cushions it through this crisis. If this went on all year and next year, etc., and the Straits of Hormuz became impassable for all this period, then that's another matter. But right now, from China's perspective, it's not good news, but it's not terrible either. India, more difficult, but it has Russian supplies for oil and again, massive amounts of coal to lean back into. So for the big players, this isn't the greatest energy crisis in history. It's really inconvenient for some, beneficial to others, but $100 oil is a reasonable reflection of that possibility. Now, the bad news, where it is augmenting existing crises and making them worse. Step forward, Europe in particular, and the UK and Germany especially. Here we have economies which have, in the British case, got out of coal, so they only have gas, very small residual nuclear, and then it's wind and solar, which it has to rely upon to produce its energy. Unsurprisingly, the UK, Britain, has the worst impact of this particular episode in the Gulf and the closing of the Straits of Hormuz. Notwithstanding the fact that it doesn't take almost anything from the Gulf at all. It is beholden to LNG cargoes on the high seas for its marginal supplies and therefore beholden on the US. No coal to fall back on. And as I say, very little nuclear left. Very exposed. And just for good measure, trying to make sure this is as difficult as possible to use oil and gas in the North Sea and closing off future options going forward. It's going to be interesting to see how this position matures. We're supposed to be en route to be a clean energy superpower, and we're going to have cheap energy, which is going to lead the world's energy-intensive industries flocking to the UK. Well, actually, we have very expensive energy, and nobody's flocking to get to the UK. Germany, it's exposed from the crisis of the cutting off of Russian gas supplies, or their substantive reduction. And without those supplies from Russia, it has had to fall back on its coal. And it does have that flex of coal, as does Poland in the current circumstances. But of course, its act of self-harm, prematurely closing its nuclear industries, cuts off that component, which could add to its security at the moment. Europe as a whole, very high energy costs, hit by this particular episode. And because of the Russian-Ukrainian position and the squeezing out of Russian gas, it's become wholly dependent on the United States and US LNG to keep it afloat. Great time for the Europeans to lambast the Americans, just when the energy position in Europe is overwhelmingly determined and dependent upon the Americans. Just think what would happen if in Europe we had the Americans decide that, you know what, we don't want our domestic customers to face higher prices, so why don't we just stop exports? Well, that really would create a really big energy crisis in Europe. But the fact is that it already has one. It's made energy choices which render it extremely uncompetitive in global markets, and that's reflected in its stagnant economic growth. Other countries, yes, the permanent problem of making ends meet remains, and some of the other Southeast Asian countries and sub-Saharan African countries and other poorer areas of the world are quite badly exposed by this current Iran war. But again, the natural response is to produce more oil and to extent gas at home, and Africa is a prime location for the intensification of the oil production industries and indeed some gas too. So the result of all this has been a massive boost for oil and gas production outside the Gulf. It's a massive boost for pipelines to divert oil and gas produced, but particularly oil in the Gulf region, out without going through the Straits of Hormuz. Bit of an own goal for the Iranians, you might think. Saudi Arabia, pretty insulated because it gets 7 million barrels a day out through its pipeline to the Red Sea and then some across to Oman as well. But this is going to carry on. And nuclear and renewables, particularly nuclear, as in the 1980s after the OPEC shock, gets a big boost too. Markets work, higher prices lead to demand destruction, and higher prices contain the seeds of their own destruction, because what follows from higher prices is more production, and as the Straits of Hormuz open up, oil prices falling back, gas prices falling back, and the role of the Gulf in the world energy markets becoming less rather than more important, and all those great plans for AI, data centers, etc. around the Gulf states, plus the wonderful tourism of places like Dubai, well, they suffer too, and other places pick up as well. So, crisis? What crisis? Problem, yes. Difficulties for some parts of the world, opportunities for others. And then finally, back to the IEA itself and the shrill proclamations about great energy crisis, etc. The IEA was set up in the 1970s in the first OPEC oil shocks, and it had two jobs: a coordination role with regard to the release of strategic stocks, that was new, and collect data. And that's what it should get back to doing. It doesn't actually determine releases of oil. That falls back on sovereign states. It's just a coordination role. And collecting the numbers, yeah, fine. Someone has to do it. In our data-rich world, many, many more players can do it in a way that they couldn't in the late 70s and the 1980s. But hey, quite a good idea to have what we might call an international energy statistical body. But let's just cut the headlines and the PR and the spin, and let's have reality in energy markets understood in its complexity rather than as simplistic claims. Energy crisis? Not really. Energy problem? Yes. Thank you.